Today we're looking at why some people are able to resist social influence. In other words, why they don't always go along with the crowd or obey authority figures. Before I go on, there's a link in the description which will take you to very useful resources that go with this video. There are two key explanations that you need to know. Social support, and that's when other people help you resist, and locus of control, a personality-based explanation about how much control you think you have over your own life. We'll go through each one slowly with examples to make them really clear. Let's start with resisting conformity. Conformity, as you know, means going along with the majority, whether or not you agree with them. Social support happens when there's at least one other person who does not conform, and that person is called a dissenter, someone who disagrees with the group. And that disagreement is powerful because it shows that the majority is not unanimous. Imagine this scenario. 5 teens in the corner of a playground. One of them offers cigarettes. 2 accept. The teen in the blue t-shirt is wavering. Should he or shouldn't he? He feels under pressure to conform. And then he notices his friend in the green shirt refusing quite firmly. The presence of the dissenter is all he needs to persuade him not to give in. That's social support. You'll remember that in Solomon Asch's line study, most participants conformed to the wrong answer. But when just one confederate gave the correct answer, conformity dropped sharply. And that person acted as a model of independent behavior. They showed it was possible to resist. So, social support doesn't have to be loud or confident. It just has to exist. And then you'll also recall that in Stanley Milgram's original study, 65% of participants obeyed the experimenter and continued to shock the learner with maximum 450 volts. But Milgram wanted to know what would happen if the participant was not alone. And so to test this, he ran a version of the study called the disobedient confederate variation. And in this version, 2 additional teachers were placed in the room with the real participant. And these teachers were actually confederates working with Milgram. At first, everything seemed to go the same as with the previous trials. All 3 teachers began the task, and they gave shocks as instructed. But as the shocks increased and the learner began to protest, the 2 confederates refused to continue. One said something like, "This is wrong, I'm not going on." And the other one followed and also refused, even when the experimenter used his verbal prods. Now the real participant was suddenly not alone. And this changed everything. When the experimenter turned to the real participant and told him to continue, most participants now also refused, and obedience dropped dramatically from 65% to just 10%. And that happened because the confederates acted as social support. By refusing, they showed the participant that disobedience was possible, the authority figure could be challenged, and saying no was allowed. In other words, the disobedient confederates broke the authority's power. They removed the feeling that the participant had no choice, and the participant could now think, if they can refuse, maybe I can too. Here's a real-world scenario. Imagine a construction site where the boss tells the workers, forget health and safety, just get the job done. The workers are about to conform, but one dissenter steps forward and challenges the boss. That's enough to break his power. Now we move to a dispositional explanation, and that's something from within the person. Julian Rotter in 1966 introduced the idea of locus of control. Locus means a place. Think location. So this is about where you believe control over your life comes from. And there are two types: internal locus of control, that is, I control what happens to me, and external locus of control, that's things happen because of luck, fate, or what other people do. People with an internal locus of control believe their actions matter. For example, I did well because I worked hard. Let's call these people internals. Internals take personal responsibility, make independent decisions, and rely on their own judgment rather than approval from others. They also tend to be more confident, so when faced with pressure, they're more likely to say, "No, this doesn't feel right," and not conform. This is why leaders often have a strong internal locus of control. They don't need the group's permission to act. Conversely, people with an external locus of control believe life is controlled by outside forces. An example would be a student reasoning that their failure to do well in an exam was because it was too difficult. Externals are more likely to go along with others, to obey authority and follow instructions without questioning, and this makes them more vulnerable to social influence. But although there are extremes, locus of control is generally a continuum, with most people sitting somewhere in the middle. The more internal you are, the more likely you resist, and the more external you are, the more likely you conform or obey. Let's do an evaluation. One strength of social support is real-world evidence. Susan Albrecht in 2006 studied teenagers trying to resist smoking. Those with a buddy or mentor were far more successful at resisting peer pressure. And this shows that social support works outside the lab, which increases validity. Gamson in 1982 found that when people worked in groups, 88% rebelled against unfair authority. Why? Because they could discuss and support each other. And this shows peer support reduces obedience by weakening authority. However, social support does not always work. Allen and Levine in 1971 wanted to know whether any social support helps people resist conformity, or whether the support has to come from someone who's seen as reliable. They used a task similar to Asch's line judgment experiment. So participants had to judge which comparison line matched a standard line. And in one condition, a confederate gave the correct answer, providing social support. And of course, conformity dropped, just like in Asch's study. But then, in another condition, the dissenter still gave the correct answer, but wore thick glasses and had previously said they had poor eyesight. And this made them seem less credible. And even though the dissenter was technically correct, participants trusted him less. This showed that it is not just having support that matters, but who the support comes from. That indicates that social support works because it confirms your judgment, reduces doubt, and makes you feel justified in resisting. But if the dissenter seems unreliable, they do not reduce uncertainty, so the majority still feels more powerful. Holland in 1967 reanalyzed data from Milgram's obedience study to see whether personality could help explain why some people resisted authority. He was interested in locus of control. After Milgram's study, participants completed a locus of control questionnaire. Holland compared participants who refused to continue with the shocks, that's the disobedient group, with the participants who went all the way to 450 volts, the obedient group. And he found that 37% of disobedient participants had an internal locus of control, whereas only 23% of obedient participants had an internal locus of control. And this shows that participants who believed that they were in control of their own actions were more likely to resist authority. but not all research agrees. Twenge et al. In 2004 challenged this idea. She and her colleagues analyzed data from obedience and conformity studies carried out in the United States over a 40-year period, so that's a meta-analysis, from the 1960s to the early 2000s. They found that people became more resistant to obedience over time. But at the same time, people also became more external in their locus of control. And this is important because it goes against what we would expect if locus of control was the main explanation for resistance. I mean, if internal locus of control alone explained resistance, then people should have become more internal and resistance should have increased because of internality. But that didn't happen. Instead, resistance increased, but so did externality. And this shows that resistance cannot be explained by locus of control alone, but is also shaped by social change, culture, and historical context. To summarize, social support helps by breaking unanimity and weakening authority, and locus of control explains why some people naturally resist more than others. Both explanations have strong research support, but neither works perfectly on its own.